there is just a better natural chemistry if you're sitting across from a person and you're not kind of like eyes darting around your computer because like somebody texts you or you get an email or something like that, and just having kind of like being in the room with somebody. I mean, I think like, we're both comedians and performers, and live is always better than digital or even a screen. So I think, we had more fun doing it that way.
We have not seen each other. I was trying to be like, how long has it been?
Well, I saw you when I was in LA last summer.
Oh, that's true.
But not to podcast.
Yeah, but yeah, we've done like live shows like on Moment House, but those are all remote as well. Like we've been in separate. We've not recorded in the same city in at this point years.
February of 2020.
Yeah,
the last time we recorded in person together.
But I don't know. It's an interesting question. I definitely feel like I made me prepare more like for the episodes because, with the delay of, video there, it can't be quite as natural as when you're in the same room. So I wanted to be a little more on top of my game so that there'd be less of those like little dead air moments. But other than that, I don't know. It's interesting to have so much of our creative partnership be remote at this point. I do feel like it is. That's probably so common now in a way it wasn't in the past. So I don't know. That's an interesting question.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think the podcast would like necessarily be different if we had been doing this in person the whole time. But I think we certainly like found our remote rhythm from doing, and then it's just like, well, now this is kind of the rhythm we're in.
I used to do all of these in person basically like up till the pandemic. And I was like very insistent on it to the point that I turned down like a lot of really good people and a lot of really good opportunities. And then it's sort of like the fact that I used to go into the office every single day. When that stopped being a thing, I can't remember what compelled me to do that previously. And at the end of the day, obviously, sure, like you lose a little bit of that, I guess, that magic, or at least your ability to kind of read people in person. It's just so much easier to do this remotely that I can't see a point in the foreseeable future where I go back to insisting on doing these in person.
I mean, I think also personally, like, I like doing it in person because like it's not my equipment and it's not my ability to troubleshoot that keeps things moving along. When we were recording in our studio, there was a sound engineer. There was, there were multiple people and like backup recordings and things like that in a way where like, obviously you can see how easily we move through a remote recording, here. And it's just like, I panic every time something freezes or isn't working because I'm like, I don't have the technical skills to assess the problem and fix it. So when that's off the table as a concern for me, and I think for Halle too, it lets us just then kind of like relax into the pod and not like, oh, I froze. Yeah. Oh, this thing won't connect. Oh, all those things are just like, I think remote work in general, and I think like the way of digitization of especially entertainment and comedy and media things, it does put a lot of the burden on performers and talent that used to be the job of somebody with expertise. And so that I think is I don't think that I've quite come all the way around to remote everything because of that, because I'm not a tech savvy person. I'm like, neither of us are. So I think like once that variable is removed, it is a lot easier to be like in the groove of like, oh, we're like riffing, we're doing all this stuff. Because I don't have to think like, if this all falls apart, like I'm alone in my apartment and probably have to call someone to walk me through fixing a problem I deeply don't understand.
It sort of reminds me, I saw somebody tweeting about OnlyFans, and not that we're delivering material of that high of value as OnlyFans, but it's almost saying is like, oh, it is good that you can make your own content and immediately put it online and like get paid for it, but it does mean like you are also the cameraman, you are also the you are the grip, editing. You are the editor, and it's like, oh yeah, like it's true of everything, and it was like just an interesting like the trade-off for remote work can be having to gain skills that are not necessarily, again, like immediately compensated, but are expected.
There's also just the very practical thing of like, if something fucks up, then you can point the finger somewhere else.
Yeah.
What has kept you remote for this long? It sounds like neither of you are particularly in love with that. And you were in the same city at one point, and you decided not to record.
I mean, we were in the same city before the pandemic started, but since the COVID lockdown began, Halle's been in LA and I've been in New York, and we both live permanently in those. So like, we can't, if we look with unlimited money, we would fly back and forth all the time and just do this in person. I think it would be a preferred.
Yeah, I moved right before I moved in January 2020 to LA, and then I came back in February, and I think we had to bank a bunch of episodes, and I think we were thinking, not always, but at the time, like, I was planning to be back in New York more often, and Alison was going to be in LA for work, so we would be able to do more stuff in person. And since the pandemic, I've been here and plan to stay here, and Alison's been in New York, and the strike is on, but once it begins again, I will, in my heart of hearts, hope Alison is forced to move to LA, because I do prefer to do things together, like in the same room. But also, I know that's not where you're at or what you're interested in, Alison. I'm just saying it would be a fun problem for us to have.
In a perfect world, we could at least be in a studio together a few times a year to get a couple episodes with the magic of us in a room together.
Yeah.
And also, maybe we'll do in-person live touring at some point, which would be, I think, a dream of both of ours. And, we're both performers, so doing it on stage, even better than a studio where we're surrounded by tech, which I think ultimately is our nemesis.
Halle, what made you move to LA?
It was love. And, It
always is. Every time I ask somebody that question, invariably.
Well, so interestingly, and I've been talking a lot, we talk a lot about this in the podcast, but especially because it's Pride Month. But basically, I moved beginning of 2020 in with my ex, who became my ex-fiance, and we lived together, various places in LA. We were in Koreatown for most of it. And then last June, I came out, having gone to therapy. Please go to therapy, everybody, and realized I was a lesbian. And we broke up. We're still dear friends. He was just on the pod. And but I really like LA, which I first moved here. I'm glad I lived in New York first, because I think that'd be a much harder. Yes. The other way seems so much harder.
The people who do the other way seem like absolute maniacs.
Yeah.
It seems so difficult.
Yeah, so but I really been enjoying living in LA, and then I got a job. I work at Crooked Media, which is the company that Ruin is now on as of April. So I think for me, I don't know. And I also like LA, as just the way I love New York. I just couldn't do New York now. I feel like I could do New York when I'm 22, but I'm at a point where I'm like, I can't do it again. Personally.
That's a really important life detail there. Realizing that you're a lesbian and coming out. That must have been a hard conversation to have with your
It sure
partner.
was. Yeah, it was funny, and it was just sort of like I realized it in therapy, and then I spent a couple weeks being like, well, how do I like hold the door closed with my foot, or like how do I make it not true? And I was like, I'll tell him in July. I genuinely don't know what I was like, I can't do it. And then in the end, he's a dear friend of mine, and it was a really hard, traumatic experience, but we've become better friends through it. And he then came out as bi afterwards. And so this is my first Pride out. It's also his first Pride out. So I do think that, not that things happen for a reason, but I do feel like it's nice to know, even in these situations where it is really difficult and really, I don't know, like you're just having to grapple with a lot, the good things can come out of it, and you can have like really beautiful, enduring friendships that out of like a template of something where you think like, well, this person was never going to speak to me again, but that wasn't the case. So I'm very grateful about that.
I was one of those people who was very hesitant to do therapy. A big part of it is the fact that my mother is a psychotherapist, which is apparently a pretty common story as far as people being put off by the process. But I, like a lot of people, hit a wall during the pandemic and got to the point
Oh, yeah,
where I was
absolutely.
like, this is an untenable situation if I don't like get on some medication and start talking to somebody. That, I mean, both the therapy itself and that realization, do you feel like that these were things that were kind of shaken loose by the stress of the last 3 years?
Absolutely. I think a lot of people came out, like there was kind of like a wave of like slightly older people coming out. I think probably also a lot of divorces, a lot of relationships, a lot of people being like, oh, I either have to go back to school or change my career, or like you said, like go to therapy and like really start managing my mental health. And it is because it is so easy to get caught in the grind of the week to week and be like, well, I'm not happy, but I got to go to work and then it's the weekend and I need some time to recoup. So the pandemic sort of disrupted all that. So it wasn't conscious. Like even that was like, I didn't realize I was lesbian from being in the pandemic, but I will say I started to work, like I travel for my current day job and I was flying a lot and I was having a lot of anxiety and stress around flying. And I do think there's something like, I don't think I would have been as anxious and distressed flying if we hadn't just spent 2 years inside. And then I would not have then gone to a therapist and then discover this other thing about myself that had nothing to do with the flying. So there is something where it's like, you can't, I don't know. If anyone feels totally mentally healthy, I support them in that. But I think a lot of us have stuff where it's like, I know I should sit with this, but it can't be this week. You know, I got work to do. And the pandemic, you know, like you said, like was a totally different way to live. And then it forced a lot of people, I think, to have conversations of like, okay, well, if I'm not happy or if this isn't working for me, like, what does that actually mean? You know, and what do I do about it?
I'm in New York and I'm living in this one bedroom. I live alone. I've had this conversation with a lot of people over the past 3 years, whether the pandemic was easier to go through with somebody in your place. I could see pluses and minuses of both sides. I think mental health wise, it's probably a lot better to have somebody around to talk to these things day by day. But in terms of not just coming out, but also in terms of dramatic changes to relationships, breakups, there's two key things at play. Just the act of being stuck inside with the same person day in, day out for so long. Really good way to test any relationship. On top of that, just basically being alone with your thoughts all the time, stuff starts to bubble up pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting point. I think to me, it's like the question is, if you live with someone, do you have a good relationship with them? Whether that's a romantic partner or a roommate or a friend. Because I think for me, you know, me and my ex are really good friends and had a great time. So I feel really grateful to have somebody. But if it had been a bad relationship, I really feel for anyone who is, especially like I know people who got divorced, you know, like being at home sort of led to that in a way that maybe not that it wouldn't have happened, it just would have maybe happened later in a different way. So I think it's like, yeah, if you are in a functional relationship, whatever that is, it would be good. If not, I mean, God, that would be so hard compared to being alone. Because at least alone, it's like you are yourself. I'm back to living alone. I found myself deeply annoying, but I at least know what she's like, you know. Versus, yeah, I don't know. That's a good question, though.
Moving to Los Angeles during the pandemic was a very good move. This was
I couldn't agree more. I completely agree.
There were a lot of long nights where I was wondering like why I was continuing to pay New York rent to live in a 1-bedroom apartment that I never left.
Mm-hmm.
I was in New York the whole time and in a much smaller 1-bedroom and then eventually a slightly larger 1-bedroom that I live in now. And but I'm like an alone person, so it was like tough and dark, but I've lived with roommates before. I've never lived with a partner, but I'm just like, I don't know. This was probably for the best for whoever would have been living with me. Like, I just don't know that I would have. Mm-hmm. I think I would have ruined someone's life and for sure a relationship if we had been locked in together. So it was tough in New York. I thought, I have friends that like bought houses upstate and like did all this stuff, but I stuck it out. I'm still here. Somehow.
I would call myself an alone person too. I mean, I live alone and I'm definitely I don't want to talk about my own therapy experiences the entire time, but these are things that I've been sort of coming to terms with, as far as sort of like the necessity of being alone, as far as the ability to, like, you do stand up, the ability to maybe go out on stage and perform in front of a bunch of people or talk to a stranger on a podcast. And then, I don't know, for me, like if I'm at a party and I don't know anybody, then I'm just like, just completely shut down.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that those things are like so different though, like being on a podcast, like being on stage, like things where there's like a really like an organizing principle to like how you'll socialize versus like a party where it's like, oh, I don't know anyone. These people all know each other. There's no contract here that like they have to talk to me or what we would talk about or all those things versus like on stage, on a podcast, in any other context, like, or if I'm just alone in a place where I went to be alone, like a bar or a restaurant, like, then I feel like it's easier than I feel like a party when you're by yourself and you don't know anybody is like the ultimate worst scenario, whether you enjoy and thrive being alone or not.
Some people like love just being there and meeting entirely new people, but I just can't relate to that in the slightest. Yeah. The other aspect of it that I've been thinking about a lot lately too is that you want to be left alone. You sort of built certain things in your life around that, and then you're alone for a really long time, and then a pandemic comes along, and you're like, "Hey, why is there nobody around me? This all of a sudden really sucks."
Yeah.
You look around, and it's hard to like to find those people because, like, whether consciously or subconsciously, you've like effectively been kind of pushing people away.
I guess that's an interesting thing to realize too, that I think probably the pandemic showed a lot of people is like, oh, if you work, there are a lot of things that could take up your time in your life. But then when those things are disrupted, it's like, oh, okay, who do I have? And not to make everything about me being queer, but I did have this experience where I was like, after I came out, I was like, and I have many wonderful friends, who are straight, obviously. And I'm so grateful for my friendships that I had before. But then I was like, oh, I really want to meet queer women and queer friends in general, just to like have people to go to like events to. And so I was like, I felt like I was in middle school again, being like, how do people make friends? Like I forgot. And the way I did it, in case I was listening, and it was like, how do I make friends? And this is specifically about queer friends, but I think you could use this for a lot of different things, which is, well, at least for me, being queer was like a play, like, okay, so that I know I can go to like queer dance night or there's like lesbian like line dancing or whatever. So I could have specific events. And then I talk to people, and it could be anything. It could be like, oh, I like video games or whatever. And then anytime you talk to anyone, if in my example, if they're queer, I said, oh, can I put you on a group chat of all the queer people I know? And for the most part, well, I have a one from work, and then I have one of lesbians I've met outside of work that I don't know. I mean, I've met like some of them one time. And for the most part, people really do want other friends, like, or make new friends. And if they don't, they will make that very clear. So there's plenty of people who are like, no, thank you. But there are a lot of people, especially because I do think it is harder to make friends outside of school or, some other reason to hang out. So people are more open to that. And especially maybe we're more open after the pandemic. And then you just have to keep asking people to things. And even if they can't make it, don't take it personally. That's fine. Everyone's busy. And then maybe they can go to the next thing. And I will say that does work, because I do feel like I have friends I could hang out with, again, in addition to my many wonderful straight and gay friends I had before. And I think that is a skill that we don't teach people. Like, we don't teach people how to make friends, and it's not intuitive. And I only did it because I felt like I would go insane if I didn't. So I was like, all right, I just have to and I also would make okay, what are the events in this week in Los Angeles for queer people? Okay, there's drag bingo. Okay, does someone want to go to that? And then through that was able to build up friendships. Yeah, I don't know. It's you're right. Like, it's hard to, it's something weird to analyze. It's weird to analyze, like, how do I make connections and relationships in my life that I don't have and I really want. And you could do it, but boy, it is a lot of work. I will say that.
I don't think you have to apologize. It's a grace period of having this, like, such a profound realization in your life that it's been, I mean, it sounds like it's been about a year at this point. I'm going to say that you get a couple of years, because
thank you.
Not that you need my permission, obviously, but we're talking about like a completely like recontextualizing the lens that you see the world through.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that because I definitely have cried so many times during Pride Month. Like, I just going to events and I'm like, okay, well, maybe next Pride it'll be fun, and also I won't cry so much. And it's all like really positive things. Like, I work at McCrook is like a progressive media company. I work with a lot of trans people who are really wonderful. And I went to this, it was like an event called Trans Joy Fest. And it was like the different things from trans like creators. They had like people got up and like would read poems, and it was so beautiful. And I was really lovely, but I'm also like, boy, I sure am crying hard in front of people I don't know. And that's fine, and everyone was really nice. But I'm like, next year I bet I'll enjoy this, and I won't be visibly sobbing during a lot of this, just because I think it is so new and it's so lovely, and it's just, I don't know, it's just it touches me to see everybody who is out in the world being like, here's my little stuff, and here's my little, what I'm trying to do. I don't know, it's so nice. So next year, I'm going to give myself another year, so I appreciate that.
Yeah, next year, no crying and Pride.
From the sound of it, it sounds like that realization isn't what it didn't create your politics. And certainly, you were able to be sort of sympathetic and empathetic to people going through that in the past. But it listen, I'm like a cis white dude. The closest I get to this is some neurodivergence, but also like the huge explosion in anti-Semitism. And for me, like, I don't know what it says about myself that it was that after all the like awful stuff that is constantly happening on Twitter, it was like clicking through and seeing some of those hashtags that really kind of made me back away, because things feel profoundly different when you have skin in the game in that way.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think, like there's so many doors to the same reality, which is that like, oh no, like every group is vulnerable if people are trying to attack people. But you're right. Like I definitely was an ally before, but I wasn't my struggle. Like I was like, well, I know that the people on the other side are wrong, but I don't necessarily know how to like help or how to think about it. And then now coming out, I'm like, oh, I guess the answer is like, we all just have to be talking and thinking about this and doing whatever we can all the time. And to your point, in every, like, it's like, if it's not queer people, if it's queer people this week, it's Jews next week. And then it's poor people the week after it. Like, unfortunately, it is everybody, but then also it gives us a level of understanding and solidarity with each other that we're going to need, clearly, because there's so many people who are so absolutely batshit insane on the other side.
A nice side effect of doing the show is that it not only gives you excuse, but it forces the two of you to talk regularly, to have those conversations. And it sounds like it's almost inevitable that some like deeply personal things are going to come out on this show where you're talking about horror movies.
Yeah, I think so. Like we talked kind of explicitly about using horror as a way to talk about horrifying things. And that, includes, anything related to the body. Like horror is about the body. And we live in a world in which so many ways, like we're so vulnerable. We talked about gun violence when we did, for example, the movie Crimes Against the Future. We were talking about queerness when we talk about queer horror movies this month. And it is, I don't know, like, yeah, there's so many different ways to talk about sort of the political environment, but horror allows for this very visceral, upsetting language that I do think is helpful to be like, it's insane that we all live under this stress and in this way and have to be vulnerable and scared like this. And horror is a way to be like, it's almost like, here's a metaphor, here's an image to reflect back to yourself and understand your own situation.
Obviously the two of you, it sounds like we're very close friends before all this, but I know a lot of people who do podcasts who like specifically go together, who specifically go out of their way to not really have conversations in the interim in order to save some of that good stuff for the show.
We used to talk a lot more only because our daytime schedules permitted us to both be fucking around all day. Both of us had a looser kind of during the day schedule and work and deadlines and kind of the ability to just be like constantly like, messaging each other just the dumbest crap we could possibly find on the internet and chatting all the time. I will say we do that less, but it is not because we are saving anything. It's certainly just because we're both like, gotta go to a meeting. Like I have a thing I gotta do. Like, yeah. Which, it's like life gets in the way or whatever. But yeah, I'll never understand. Like I understand like if like we're chatting before and I've done this certainly with other podcasts and comedy people, you know, we're friends and we're talking and we're goofing off before recording starts. And it's like, well, let's save this because like we're already talking. But I think being in constant contact and having all kinds of conversations and all kinds of means of communication is only helps like what comes through on the podcast when we're recording about a movie, because I think we do know each other super well. And that is like part of why it works.
Not by design that the two of you aren't speaking as frequently as you used to, but because the two of you aren't speaking as frequently as you used to due to these external factors, again, that must really amp up the impulse to have really personal conversations, because in a strange way, like your major outlet to do that is one that happens to be listened to by a lot of people.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I feel like, I don't know, I definitely, we are both, I hate to be like, we're both artists, but there is something about like Alison doing comedy. I think there's like, not that people expect you to give of yourself, but to me, it's always been clear how much more people get out of it, and people as performers get to give if they are vulnerable. I mean, I don't want to speak for you, Alison, how you feel about that, but I don't know. Like, I think there's something about, yeah, I don't know, like having a window into our friendship, or that we're talking to each other and being very candid and honest. Like those are the conversations I like to listen to and I get a lot out of, and sort of feeling other people's friendships. So yeah, I definitely think, I don't know. I know there is a downside, and that downside is like people forming parasocial relationships with you because you don't know them, which I do think can be harmful. But the flip side of that is, I don't know, like people need to feel like the human on the other side of the screen, you know, in whatever way that manifests itself.
And I think like when you have a close like friendship and personal relationship with like the person that you're making something like our podcast with, it's like I think we both just feel safe enough in the recordings, in our conversations with each other, that like if things do go in a political or a personal or a darker, like, you know, any of the angles that a conversation can end up taking, that we both feel like we're doing it together and feel like comfortable and interested in doing that, versus, you know, if you don't know someone as well, you're not as likely to feel ready to reveal something about yourself, because you don't, not only do you not know what an audience might think, but you don't know what the person on the other end of the microphone is going to say. But I think that Halle and I both, you know, we have that like, it's like having a safety net.
That idea of parasocial relationships, is that something that you've experienced from the other side of like people maybe being a little too familiar in spite of the fact that they've never met you?
I don't know. I mean, I feel like so much of it's in social media, and maybe we just have like a particular kind group of sweetie pies who listen to our podcast. But I feel like people have been like so encouraging and so sweet. Yeah. I also feel like we're not like engaged. Like, I mean, not that we can engage with fans, but like I do feel like you sometimes see, I don't know. I think about when Taylor Swift used to have fans to her house, and I'm like, like there is a repercussion to that, and that is that people think like, okay, so we're friends, and it's like, I respect the people who listen, they respect us, but nobody's coming at us sideways, and I think that is in part because it's like you're seeing what we want you to see. You're not necessarily. We're not creating the illusion that you're seeing every part of our lives, which I think is important.
There are real boundaries. And I think like also like because it's like we talk about our lives and we talk about our thoughts and our opinions. I'm like, I think people really do have a sense of who we are when they listen to the podcast, but it's not kind of this like long, windy, unwieldy thing where it's like we have to reveal everything. Like we're talking about a horror movie, like when it's relevant, we bring in our lives, but it's not like we're just constantly like, you're tuning in because you want to hear everything about my day. Like you're tuning in because you want to hear Halle talk about this movie, me be really upset by the movie. And I think like that's what keeps like a kind of a nice buffer. Whereas like when I do stand up and it's very personal after shows, I feel like people will like come up and say things or have expectations, you know, if they message you that like, oh, well, you just told me like everything about you. So I know you. And it's like, well, no, you don't at all.
In a lot of ways, stand up is a lot more structured and a lot more rehearsed and is therefore like more curated as far as what you're actually like putting out there versus having, you know, it's spontaneous conversation on a podcast.
Right. Absolutely.
We talked a little bit about this idea of horror as allegory, which like is certainly always always been the case to a certain extent. It seems like horror movies of more recent vintage are leaning even more heavily on it. But Alison is somebody who's had I don't know if morbid curiosity is the right word, but has been very like interested.
No, it is.
In this space, in spite of like not being able to actually like sit through an entire movie. Or how much of your interest is because of this notion of allegory?
I mean, I think like I was an English major. Like I love overanalyzing something. That's like all I really do anyway. Yeah, it is to kind of be like, and I think like when we first started doing the podcast, I had I often asked a question that I don't anymore, just because I think it's been like we've reinterpreted it and it's been reframed a little bit as we've gotten deeper into like how do we talk about these movies? What exactly am I actually asking for? Where I'd be like, well, what was kind of like moral, like the moral of the story, not like the morals of a movie. But like I was always like, well, what was it trying to say? And because I think that we especially had talked about some movie, and I've seen a couple of horror movies, and I have found almost all of them to have like a real, allegory to the experience of being alive. And Get Out and Silence of the Lambs, I think there's a lot. Like I respond, like that's the part I liked, and like what kind of got me through those movies was like connecting to those allegories and metaphors and morals or whatever you want to call them. So I don't like ask that question anymore when we do the podcast, because I think like we're a little bit more explicit, and like Halle has done such a nice job of kind of weaving how do we extrapolate from this movie to like our lives, our experiences, the existence of culture and society. Like I think that we've even begun talking about those connections more. That is kind of like why I always wanted to know what happened in movies anyway, because like that's the interesting, like, yeah, like who died and how, sure. But if I'm not watching it, that's little lost on me versus like, what was this movie trying to say about humanity? Not to make it sound so like pretentious and lofty, but like really like that is what you're asking when you want to know what a movie's about. So, I think that that's been the thing that is always connecting me to it. And I think that like, as we've done the podcast more and more and kind of found our groove, and now that we're with Crooked and there's such a robust political atmosphere at the company, and that lets us kind of tap into that more. Like, I think we've really like doubled down on that focus. And I think like whether it's political or whether it's just kind of like how people interact or what, like, I think that those things are what's interesting to me. I think that's what's interesting to people who listen. And I think that's why like the podcast can even exist. Cause just like a play-by-play of beheadings is not that exciting after 4 episodes. You know what I mean? Audio, I mean,
in terms of the actual movies that you're choosing, is relevance to the current moment, is that key?
I think so, or at least we try for it to be. I mean, it's not, you can't be 1-to-1 or whatever, but I think the nice thing about horror is that it, there's an unending amount of it. And so much of it reflects like all like societal fears about like, like think about like Rosemary's Baby. And it's like, we live in a world where Roe vs. Wade has been overturned. Right. Like as a woman, that's terrifying. So it's like that whole constellation of body horror. I think horror is political because the body is political. So, for example, for Pride, we're doing a month of queer or queer coded horror movies. But, I mean, truly, I don't know. It's like, I'm sure there is a horror movie that can't in any way connect to something, but we haven't found it yet, my friend.
Yeah, no, not yet.
The last several movies that have been mentioned, Rosemary's Baby, Silence of the Lambs, Get Out, or all these, really like critically lauded movies. They're all considered great movies, in their own way, but you don't have to dig very far into the horror genre to come up with like some really awful stuff. And I'm, like a lot of people, one of the things, I was not a horror person at all, but one of my weird comfort things that I developed over the past 3 years was like watching the worst horror movies possible. Like the worse they are, the less redeeming value they have. That like if you really start scrolling down on Amazon Prime, you get some good stuff. I mean, I've watched all of the Leprechaun movies now. It starts off from a pretty bad place and it just gets considerably worse. Are you still able to mine that sort of subject matter in a movie that's that awful?
Oh, sure. I mean, one of our favorite episodes was this movie, Madman. And it was, just a regular slasher at a summer camp. But like you find out pretty far into the movie that it's actually a fall camp and they're going to go on Thanksgiving break. And it's like, what the fuck are you talking about? In New York. So I definitely think so. I think we love trash. I think horror is a genre in which the idea of a good or bad movie is irrelevant. I think it's an effective movie. It's a movie that if it has it, sort of, because there's a lot of like movies on paper that are competently made, but they are not going to grab you. And so I definitely think trash is one of definitely a beloved topic. We love trash. We truly do.
It gives the podcast like some nice peaks and valleys where it's like sometimes there's episodes that are really heavy because there's no lightness or silliness to the movie we're talking about. And we're obviously not going to bring lightness and silliness to something when, especially if it has ties to kind of any of the current moment or, anything just like generally horrific for a group of people. But like, you can't have every episode be this kind of heavy-handed, super relevant, deep dive, trauma bond. But you also don't want every episode to be like Leprechaun in space. It's like, I think what's fun about horror is there's so many different corners of the genre that it lets the podcast stay very fresh and kind of lets us kind of keep, if we're like, oh God, we've done a whole bunch of this kind of thing. Like, let's do something kind of goofy or something that Halle's going to hate, or something that everybody loves, or something that's like kind of more of a thriller, or kind of more, of all the different kind of subgenres within horror and the varying like quote unquote quality standards of different movies. I think that's why you could do this podcast in this genre and have so much freedom and flexibility to kind of make a fun show that stays interesting and different week to week versus I think other genres you can get a little weighed down in just the fact that there isn't as much breadth within it.
Yeah, like probably no one's going to be brutally murdered at the end of a rom-com. Like, what's going to happen.
Is it possible, though, to bring fun, to bring lightness and silliness to an incredibly depressing movie?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
I think we've done it, too.
Horror, yeah, definitely. I think horror is inherently leans towards the absurd. You have to take something horrible in real life and then depict it for the screen, so you have to alter it in some way that could either be camp or it could be funny or it could be like surreal. And I think all those moments are the art of horror, and then also moments for us to sort of blow out and make funny.
Knowing that, we're talking about horror movies, none of these are documentaries, none of this is true crime. Like, certainly some things are like based on a true story or something like that, but it doesn't get as bogged down in the way that like the true crime genre can, where it's like, well, what are we going to goof around about? Like, these people died, that's sad. Yeah. That's a cold case. That's a true, like, that somebody was murdered, like those things, it's so hard. And depending on who you are, like, I don't know if it's a good or a bad idea to even really dive into that world, but like, we're talking about fictional things and fictional people. And there is like that nice distance between like the world of the movie and the world we live in, that if we're like, this guy's an idiot, like, I can't believe he would go back into that room. He deserves to get stabbed. And it's like, okay, well, like, that person didn't get stabbed. That's an actor who got paid to have blood put on his shirt. Like, there is like kind of a little bit of wiggle room to get silly without it feeling, I don't want to say distasteful because I don't want to put down people who make true crime content, but we don't have to worry about kind of real life implications necessarily of the things we're talking about, because it is all fictional characters and fictional scenarios.
Alison, you specifically, I'm curious, as somebody with far less of a frame of reference for horror movies, having not really watched many, how the show has sort of shaped your relationship to the genre.
One of the things I love about it is that horror is a beloved genre, and there are movies in horror that are so outrageously popular and baked into our culture that they were references. I'm a huge Simpsons fan. I love the Treehouse of Horror episodes. I missed every reference to a movie whenever I've watched it, and like not even like specifically scary Halloween episodes, but like there are just references all throughout our culture, because these are great movies with like really interesting artistic decisions and cool writing. Like there is, like, I appreciate the genre so much. I'm just like squeamish about that kind of thing. I'll watch women throw wine on each other on Bravo all day, and I understand that makes Halle uncomfortable.
Yeah, no, I can't watch reality TV. I can't stand conflict. I can't watch conflict. I can't.
But I think like we've done so much and covered so much. It's been very cool to kind of be like, oh my God, that's what that reference is in this movie or TV show, or this joke somebody tells, or this book I read. Like, it's kind of giving me an education in, it feels like taking a college class almost sometimes. So I love it, and I still have no interest in watching 99.8% of the movies that we've covered.